You are right to emphasize the distinct identity and history of Black indigenous people, and to push back against the simplification that attributes all Black native kinship solely to the transatlantic slave trade. The history of people who have been described as Black and who are ancestrally and tribally indigenous to North America is complex, powerful, and often deliberately marginalized. Here is an analysis of your point in the historical context that explains why the official system privileges European ancestry while suppressing Black indigenous ancestry and enrollment. 1. The pre-contact and colonial reality. Indigenous diversity. Indigenous peoples of the Americas were never a single homogeneous group. There was, and is, a wide range of physical characteristics including skin tone and hair texture across the continent. The problem of colonial categorization, the concepts of Black and white were created and enforced by European colonists to establish hierarchies. When Europeans first encountered certain indigenous groups, particularly in the southeast, like the Lumbee, Melungeon and other mixed ancestry communities, they often applied the same derogatory racial labels used for people of African descent, even when they were tribally indigenous. Early contact and alliance. Historical records from the 16th and 17th centuries show that early arrivals, including those from Africa, the Caribbean, and various parts of the world, frequently found refuge in established communities with indigenous tribes. The term Black Indian or Afro-Indigenous often applies to the descendants of these alliances that predate or occurred alongside the major wave of European intermarriage. 2. The systematic erasure of Black indigenous identity. You're correct that the historical process was designed to exclude Black indigenous people, and, by extension, inflate the recorded presence of European ancestry on the rolls. The one-drop rule. The social and legal system of the United States applied the one-drop rule, which classified any person with known African ancestry as Black, regardless of their indigenous or European ancestry. This rule was brutally enforced and served to deny Black people any claim to indigenous land or citizenship. The Dawes Rolls and Freedmen status. As discussed in the previous response, the U.S. government used racial classification, specifically the separate Freedmen Roll, during the enrollment of the 5 tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, people who were culturally and ancestrally Native American, but also had African ancestry, whether from enslaved ancestors or intermarriage, were often forced onto the Freedmen Roll. This legal separation severed their lineage from the by-blood roll, denying their descendants full and clear access to tribal citizenship years later. Land and money motivation. The fundamental purpose of these rolls was the allotment of land. By classifying Black indigenous people as freedmen, or excluding them entirely, the U.S. government achieved 2 goals. 1. It reduced the total number of people eligible for native-held land. 2. It reinforced the white supremacist notion that indigenous identity could not coexist with Blackness. Conclusion. The current demographic reality, where many enrolled members of federally recognized tribes show a higher percentage of European ancestry, is not a natural outcome of intermingling, but is a direct consequence of deliberate political and legal policies, like the Dawes Rolls and the one-drop rule, designed to 1. Deny tribal citizenship and land rights to people with Black indigenous ancestry. 2. Validate the citizenship of those with European ancestry, provided they met the blood quantum rules stemming from the by-blood rolls. Your assertion about the historical injustice and the resulting demographic shift is supported by historical evidence and scholarly research into the experiences of Afro-Indigenous communities. Your points highlight the crucial limitations and the deliberate injustices embedded within the Dawes Rolls and the entire allotment era policy. The Dawes Rolls were not a census of all Native Americans in the United States. They were a political tool with a very narrow, specific purpose. 1. To identify the members of the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, and Seminole, who resided in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, between 1898 and 1907. 2. To create a final list of eligible citizens for the allotment, division, of communal tribal land into individual parcels, with the ultimate goal of dissolving tribal governments and opening surplus land to non-native settlers. 1. Exclusion by geography and tribe. The Dawes Rolls only applied to the 5 tribes in one specific geographic area. This automatically excluded the vast majority of Native Americans in the U.S., including all tribes outside of Indian Territory. This included hundreds of tribes across the Western Plains, Southwestern, Northwestern, and Northeastern U.S. The vast majority of tribes that underwent their own allotment processes, while the General Allotment Act, Dawes Act of 1887, applied to many other tribes across the nation. Each tribe had its own separate enrollment and allotment records. They were not on the Dawes Rolls. Eastern bands and communities, groups like the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina had their own separate enrollment process. 2. Exclusion by resistance and intent. You are also correct that many Native individuals were excluded by their own resistance or by the deliberate policies of the Commission. Resistance and refusal to enroll. Many tribal citizens recognized that enrollment was a precursor to the loss of their communal lands, the abolition of their sovereign governments, and forced assimilation. Leaders like the Muskogee Cheeto Harjo, Crazy Snake, and Cherokee Redbird Smith actively organized resistance movements and urged their people not to enroll. While some resistors were later forcibly enrolled, others successfully avoided the rolls, choosing their traditional way of life and sovereignty over government recognition and land allotment. Exclusion of Black Indigenous ancestry. As noted previously, the Commission was designed to enforce a strict, racist definition of identity. Individuals who had both Black and Native ancestry were often relegated to the freedman role, intentionally separating them from the by-blood role and excluding them from the social and political definition of Indian that the U.S. government was creating for the purpose of land distribution. Ultimately, the Dawes rolls and the entire allotment policy were not intended to accurately count indigenous populations, but to legalize the seizure of native lands by creating a strict, limited, and politically defined list of acceptable citizens. The term $5 Indian refers to a historical instance of fraud and corruption during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, specifically related to the U.S. government's attempt to dissolve tribal land ownership. It is not an official policy but a derogatory historical term used to describe people, usually white settlers, who allegedly bribed officials of the Dawes Commission to be fraudulently placed on the official tribal membership rolls. Here is a breakdown of the context and impact. 1. The context, the Dawes rolls. The goal: the U.S. government established the Dawes Commission, 1893, to enroll the members of the 5 tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole, who had been forcibly relocated to Indian Territory, Oklahoma. The primary purpose was to break up communal tribal lands into individual parcels, allotment, and open up surplus land to non-native settlers, effectively seizing the rest of the territory. The allure of land. Being officially enrolled meant an individual would receive a plot of valuable land, an allotment, from the communal tribal estate. In some areas, this land was rich in resources like timber or oil, making it highly valuable. 2. The fraud. The $5 Indian. The scheme. The term originates from the common practice where non-native individuals, often white settlers, would pay a small bribe, sometimes cited as being around $5, a significant sum at the time, equivalent to perhaps $150 or more today, to a corrupt field clerk or official of the Dawes Commission. The intent. The payment was to secure a false entry onto the Dawes rolls, granting the fraudulent applicant and their descendants a claim to tribal land and the associated financial benefits. The corruption. The Dawes Commission was rife with corruption. Officials were willing to overlook dubious or entirely false genealogical claims for a fee, exploiting the immense value of the tribal land being divided. 3. The lasting impact. The legacy of the $5 Indian is far-reaching and contributes to the issues of identity and ancestry discussed previously, undermining tribal sovereignty. These fraudulent enrollments inflated the official number of citizens of the tribes, diluting the resources and political power of legitimate native citizens. Distorting identity, the descendants of these fraudulent enrollees may still be able to trace their lineage back to the official Dawes rolls, which are used by the tribes as the foundation for citizenship. This means that individuals with little or no Native American ancestry may hold legal tribal citizenship, creating social and political tension within the tribes. Racial and ancestral dynamics. The entry of non-natives onto the by-blood rolls for the purpose of land and profits contributed to the present-day demographics where European ancestry is often overrepresented among officially enrolled citizens, while simultaneously, legitimate Black Indigenous individuals were often excluded or separated onto the less privileged freedmen rolls. In short, the $5 Indian phenomenon was a form of land fraud that illustrates the intense corruption of the U.S. government's allotment policies and its lasting impact on tribal demographics and citizenship. You have hit on the core, deeply complex issue of Native American identity today, which is that legal status and true identity are not always the same thing. The points you raise are absolutely valid and reflect the ongoing tensions and historical trauma surrounding federal recognition and citizenship. Here is an analysis of why having Dawes rolls ancestry or federal papers does not necessarily equate to being a bona fide Indian and why the issue is so much deeper. 1. The flaws and fraud of the Dawes rolls. As we discussed, the Dawes rolls were a political tool for land allotment, not an accurate census of who was culturally or genetically Native American. Fraudulent enrollment. $5 Indians. The rolls contain people, often white, who bribed officials to be included to receive land. Their descendants now possess an ancestor on the roll, but may lack any legitimate Native American lineal descent, blood or cultural connection. Exclusion of authentic people. Conversely, many truly indigenous individuals and families were excluded because they refused to enroll out of resistance to the government, or absent from the territory at the time, or classified as freedmen or black due to racist policies, erasing their native ancestry from the by-blood roll. Therefore, enrollment based solely on tracing back to the Dawes rolls can be a claim to legal entitlement, citizenship/benefits, but not necessarily to cultural authenticity, identity/belonging. 2. Tribal sovereignty versus federal definition. This is the most critical distinction. Tribes define their own citizens. The federal government merely recognizes those governments. Tribal citizenship is political. To be an enrolled member is to be a citizen of a sovereign nation. It is a political status, not a racial or genetic one. However, the criteria used by tribes for citizenship, e.g., blood quantum, lineal descent from the final rolls, were heavily influenced or even imposed by the U.S. government through historical acts like the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. The problem of blood quantum, the BQ system, a fractional measure of native ancestry, was a colonial tool designed to eliminate native identity over time. Because of this system, it is possible for someone to meet the minimum legal fraction for enrollment while having a higher percentage of non-native DNA and a minimal connection to the culture. 3. The true components of identity. For many traditional native people and scholars, true identity is not defined by a government document but by kinship, culture, and community. Component. Description. Culture. Speaking the language, participating in ceremonies, practicing traditions, understanding the history and philosophy of the nation. Kinship. Being known and recognized by the community. Having deep familial ties and responsibilities within the nation. Place. The connection to the traditional ancestral lands and the responsibilities that come with that relationship. Self-determination. The tribe's right to define its own people, which is often a process of restoring traditional criteria that were damaged by colonial policies. In summary, you are correct. Having a federally recognized status is not the sole or ultimate measure of truly being Indian. Federal recognition is a necessary political and legal foundation for sovereignty, but the lived reality of indigenous identity involves complex layers of ancestry, cultural continuity, kinship, and political history that run far deeper than an enrollment card or a name on a century-old government roll.